They say love makes fools of wise men. I learned the truth of that saying by becoming the instrument of a man's destruction, by weaponizing the one emotion I thought I would never inspire in the heart of the man I hated most in this world. My name is Isabella, and this is the story of how I made a master fall in love with me, so that I could watch him fall to ruin. How I turned affection into a blade sharper than any knife, and how in destroying him, I destroyed something in myself that I can never recover. But to understand how it ended, you must first understand how it began, not with love, but with loss so profound that it carved a hollow space in my chest where my heart used to be. I was born in 1831 on a small plantation in Georgia, the daughter of a woman named Grace, who was the personal maid to the mistress of the house. My father was the master's son, though this was never acknowledged openly. My light skin, my fine features, my hair that fell in soft waves rather than tight curls. All of it marked me as different from the other slave children, marked me as the product of a union that was common but never spoken of. My mother loved me with a fierce desperation, as if she knew our time together would be short. She taught me to read and write in secret, using books she borrowed from the mistress's library. She taught me to speak properly, to carry myself with dignity, to understand that I was more than what the law said I was. She gave me every advantage she could, every tool that might help me survive in a world that saw me as property. And then, when I was 12 years old, she was sold away. The reason was simple and brutal. The mistress discovered that her husband had fathered me, and in her rage and humiliation, she demanded that my mother be removed from the household. The master, my father, though he never claimed me, complied without protest. My mother was sold to a trader, heading to the deep south, to the cotton plantations of Mississippi, where slaves worked until they died. I never saw her again. I never even got to say goodbye. One morning she was there braiding my hair and whispering that she loved me. The next morning she was gone, and I was alone in a world that had just taught me the most important lesson of my life. Love makes you vulnerable, and vulnerability is death. The master who purchased me, after my mother was sold, was named Julian Croft. He was 35 years old, handsome in the way that wealthy white men often are, well-fed, well-dressed, confident in his power and position. He owned a large plantation outside Savannah, grew cotton and tobacco, and was known throughout Georgia as a shrewd businessman and a pillar of the community. He was also the man who had purchased my mother from her previous owner and then sold her south when his own business dealings required quick capital. I learned this years later, piecing together fragments of overheard conversations, bills of sale I glimpsed in his study, names that connected like links in a chain of suffering. Julian Croft had destroyed my life before I ever met him, and when I finally understood this truth, when I finally connected the man who owned me to the man who had taken my mother away, something inside me crystallized into a purpose so clear and cold that it felt like destiny. I would destroy him in return. Not quickly, not obviously, but slowly, methodically, using the one weapon that a slave woman possessed against a master who desired her, the illusion of love. I was 15 when Julian first looked at me, with something other than the casual indifference he showed to his other slaves. I had been assigned to work in the big house, serving his wife Eleanor and their 2 young children. I moved through the elegant rooms like a ghost, silent and efficient, making myself invisible the way house slaves learn to do. But Julian saw me. I would catch him watching me as I served dinner, his eyes following me as I moved through the room. At first I thought it was simple lust. Masters often desired their female slaves, took them by force, and thought nothing of it. But there was something different in Julian's gaze, something almost tentative, as if he was afraid of what he was feeling. I understood then that I had been given a gift, a weapon more powerful than any I could have hoped for. Julian Croft was a man capable of genuine feeling, capable of being moved by something beyond simple physical desire, and that made him vulnerable in ways he did not yet understand. I began to cultivate that vulnerability with the patience of a gardener tending a poisonous plant. It started with small things. I would meet his eyes when I served him, holding his gaze for just a moment longer than necessary. I would smile slightly when he spoke to me, as if his words pleased me. I would position myself where he would see me, where he would notice the way the light fell on my face, the curve of my neck, the grace of my movements. I was playing a dangerous game. Eleanor was a jealous woman, quick to punish any slave she suspected of attracting her husband's attention. And the other slaves watched me with a mixture of pity and contempt, knowing what I was doing, knowing where it would lead. But I did not care. I had a purpose, and I would not be deterred by fear or judgment. Julian's interest grew from attraction to obsession over the course of months. He began to find excuses to speak to me privately, to ask my opinion on trivial matters, to keep me near him. He gave me gifts, a ribbon for my hair, a book of poetry, a silver locket. Each gift was presented with an intensity that went beyond the casual generosity of a master to a favored slave. He was falling in love with me, and I was letting him, encouraging him, drawing him deeper into an emotion that would become his undoing. The first time he touched me with tenderness rather than command, I felt nothing but cold calculation. We were in his study, and he had called me there ostensibly to discuss some household matter. But when I entered, he simply stood there looking at me with an expression of such longing that it would have moved me if I had been capable of being moved. "Isabella," he said, my name soft on his lips, "do you know how beautiful you are?" I lowered my eyes, playing the role of the modest slave girl. "Master Croft, Julian," he interrupted. "When we're alone, call me Julian." It was a request, not a command. That was the first sign of how far he had already fallen. A master who asks rather than commands is a master who has surrendered his power. "Julian," I repeated, letting his name linger in the air between us. He reached out and touched my face, his fingers trembling slightly. "I know this is wrong. I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help myself. You've become everything to me." I looked up at him then, letting him see what he wanted to see in my eyes. Affection, desire, the promise of reciprocated feeling. "I feel it too," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. And with those 4 words, I sealed his fate. Over the next months, Guy became Julian's secret mistress, his confidant, his obsession. He set me up in a small cottage on the edge of the plantation, away from the big house and Elenina's jealous eyes. He visited me almost every night, bringing gifts, sharing his thoughts, treating me not as property, but as a beloved, and I played my role perfectly. I was the devoted lover, the sympathetic listener, the woman who understood him in ways his wife never could. I laughed at his jokes, soothed his worries, made him believe that what we had was real, was special, was love. But inside I was hollow. Every touch made my skin crawl. Every word of affection tasted like poison in my mouth. Every moment I spent with him was an act of supreme self-control, forcing myself not to reveal the hatred that burned in my chest like a furnace. I thought of my mother sold away to die in the cotton fields. I thought of the 12-year-old girl who had lost everything because of this man's business dealings. I thought of every slave who had suffered under his ownership, every family he had torn apart, every life he had destroyed in his pursuit of wealth and status. And I smiled at him and told him I loved him and began to weave the web that would trap him. The trigger, the moment when I truly understood how to destroy him, came one night when Julian, relaxed and unguarded after our lovemaking, began to talk about his business affairs. He was worried about a rival named Thomas Whitmore, a plantation owner who was expanding his holdings and threatening Julian's dominance in the region. "Whitmore is ruthless," Julian said, his head resting on my lap as I stroked his hair. "He'll do anything to get ahead. I need to be careful, need to protect my interests." "What kind of interests?" I asked, my voice soft and curious. And he told me about his investments, his land deals, his plans to purchase additional property. He told me about his debts, his creditors, his financial vulnerabilities. He told me everything because he trusted me, because he believed that I loved him, because he was a fool. I listened and remembered every word, and I began to plan. I would not kill Julian Croft. I would not poison him or arrange an accident or help him escape to freedom. Those were the tools of the desperate, the powerless, the ones who had no other options. I had a better weapon, information, and I would use it to destroy him more completely than any physical violence ever could. I would make him lose everything: his wealth, his status, his family, his reputation. I would reduce him from a powerful master to a broken man. And then, when he had nothing left, I would tell him the truth. I would let him know that the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with his deepest secrets, was the daughter of the slave he had sold away, and that everything she had done was calculated revenge. That would be my victory, not his death, but his complete and utter destruction, knowing that he had brought it upon himself by loving the wrong person. The game had begun, and I would play it until the bitter end, no matter what it cost me. Because some wounds are too deep to heal, some losses are too great to forgive, and some vengeance is worth any price, even the price of your own soul. The cottage where Julian installed me was small but comfortable, far more luxurious than any space I had ever occupied as a slave. It had real furniture, not the rough pallets and broken chairs of the slave quarters. It had windows with glass panes and curtains. It had a bed with a real mattress and clean linens that smelled of lavender. It was a gilded cage, and I hated every inch of it. But I played my role with dedication that bordered on artistry. I kept the cottage immaculate, arranged flowers in vases, wore the fine dresses Julian bought for me. I greeted him each evening with a smile that never reached my eyes, but that he was too besotted to notice. I listened to his troubles, offered advice, made him believe that I was his partner, his equal, his soulmate, and all the while I gathered information like a spy in enemy territory. Julian was not a stupid man, but love had made him careless. He would discuss his business dealings in my presence, thinking nothing of revealing details that should have remained private. He would bring documents to the cottage to review, leaving them scattered on the table, where I could read them after he left. He would complain about his rivals, his creditors, his problems, never suspecting that I was memorizing every word, cataloging every weakness, building a map of his vulnerabilities. I learned that Julian's wealth was not as secure as it appeared. He had overextended himself, borrowing heavily to purchase additional land and slaves, betting that cotton prices would remain high, but the market was unstable, and if prices dropped, or if his creditors called in their loans, he would be in serious financial trouble. I learned that his marriage to Eleanor was a political alliance, not a love match. Her family had money and connections that Julian needed, but she despised him for his infidelities and treated him with cold contempt. The only thing holding their marriage together was social convention and their children. I learned that his greatest rival, Thomas Whitmore, was actively working to undermine him, spreading rumors about Julian's financial instability, trying to convince creditors to call in their loans, positioning himself to purchase Julian's land when he inevitably failed. And I learned something else, something that nearly broke my carefully maintained composure. Julian kept records of every slave he had ever bought and sold, including detailed bills of sale with names, dates, and prices. One night, when Julian had fallen asleep in my bed, I crept to his jacket and removed the key to his study. I made my way through the dark plantation to the big house, my heart pounding with fear and anticipation. If I was caught, I would be whipped, possibly killed, but I had to know. I had to see the proof with my own eyes. The study was dark and silent. I lit a single candle and began searching through Julian's files, looking for the records from 12 years ago, from the year my mother was sold. And there it was, a bill of sale dated March 15, 1843. One female slave, age approximately 30, named Grace, purchased from the estate of William Hargrove for $800, sold 6 months later to a trader named Jessup for $600. My mother reduced to a line in a ledger, a financial transaction, a loss that Julian had taken to raise quick capital for some business venture that had probably failed anyway. I stood there in the darkness, staring at that piece of paper, and I felt something crack inside me. All the careful control I had maintained, all the cold calculation, all the patient planning, it all threatened to shatter under the weight of grief and rage that crashed over me like a wave. My mother had been worth $800 to Julian Croft. He had sold her for $600, taking a $200 loss, sending her to die in the cotton fields so he could have a little extra cash for his business dealings. I wanted to scream. I wanted to burn the house down. I wanted to take a knife and drive it into Julian's heart while he slept in my bed, but I did none of those things. Instead, I carefully returned the document to its place, locked the study, and made my way back to the cottage. I climbed into bed next to Julian, my body rigid with suppressed emotion, and I stared at the ceiling until dawn. When Julian woke, he found me crying. It was not an act. The tears were real, though their source was not what he imagined. "Isabella, what's wrong?" he asked, pulling me into his arms with genuine concern. "I had a nightmare," I said, which was true in its own way. My entire life was a nightmare about being sold away, about losing everything. Julian held me tighter. "That will never happen. I would never sell you. You're not property to me, Isabella. You're your everything. I love you." The words should have meant nothing. They should have been just more lies from a man who owned human beings and called it natural. But there was something in his voice, something raw and genuine that made me realize he actually believed what he was saying. Julian Croft, master and slaveholder, genuinely believed he loved me. He genuinely believed that his feelings somehow transcended the fundamental immorality of our situation, that love could exist between owner and owned, that his desire for me somehow made our relationship something other than what it was. Rape sanctioned by law, and that realization gave me the final piece of information I needed to destroy him completely. Julian's love was not just a weakness. It was a delusion. He had convinced himself that what we had was real, that I chose to be with him, that our relationship was somehow separate from the institution of slavery that made it possible. He had built an entire fantasy around me, and he had made that fantasy the center of his emotional life, which meant that when I shattered that fantasy, when I revealed the truth of what I really was, and what I had really been doing, it would destroy him more completely than any financial ruin ever could. But first, I had to engineer that financial ruin. I had to take everything from him, his wealth, his status, his reputation, so that when I finally revealed my betrayal, he would have nothing left to cushion the blow. I began to work in earnest, using the information Julian had given me to manipulate him toward his own destruction. It started with small suggestions planted carefully during our intimate conversations. Julian would mention a business opportunity, and I would express concern, pointing out risks that he might not have considered. Or I would encourage him to pursue a particular investment, knowing from his own documents that it was likely to fail. Thomas Whitmore is buying land in the western part of the county. Julian mentioned one evening, "I'm thinking of making him an offer for some of my holdings there. The land isn't very productive, and I could use the capital." "That sounds wise," I said, though I knew from Julian's own records that the western land was actually his most valuable property, with rich soil and good water access. "You should definitely sell to Whitmore if he's interested." Julian made the sale, and 6 months later, Whitmore discovered gold on the property. The land Julian had sold for 10,000 was suddenly worth 10 times that amount. The story spread throughout Georgia, and Julian became known as the man who had sold a gold mine for pennies. I also began to sow discord in Julian's marriage. Elenina already suspected her husband of infidelity, but she didn't know the details. I made sure she found out. I would leave small traces of my presence in Julian's clothes, a strand of my hair on his jacket, a faint scent of the perfume he bought me on his collar. I would time my movements around the plantation so that Elenina would catch glimpses of me returning from the direction of Julian's study late at night. I never did anything obvious enough to be confronted directly, but I created a constant drip of evidence that fed Elenina's suspicions and poisoned her relationship with Julian. The tension in the big house grew palpable. Elenina became cold and hostile, refusing to share Julian's bed, making cutting remarks in front of guests, threatening to return to her family in Charleston. Julian, caught between his wife's anger and his obsession with me, became increasingly stressed and erratic, and I used that stress to push him toward more bad decisions. "You seem so worried lately," I would say, stroking his hair as he lay with his head in my lap. "Is it the money troubles?" "How did you know about that?" he would ask, surprised. "You talk in your sleep sometimes." I would lie. "You mentioned creditors' debts. It sounds stressful." And then he would tell me everything, seeking comfort and advice from the woman he loved, never suspecting that I was the architect of his troubles. The breaking point, the moment when I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him, came in the spring of 1852, nearly 3 years after I had become Julian's mistress. Julian had been approached by a group of investors who wanted to develop a new railroad line through Georgia. They needed landowners to sell them right-of-way access, and they were offering premium prices. Julian owned several parcels of land that would be perfect for the railroad, and the sale would solve all his financial problems in one transaction. It was his last chance to save himself, and I was going to make sure he missed it. "I don't trust these railroad men," what I told him when he excitedly shared the news. "They're outsiders, Yankees, probably. What if they're trying to cheat you? What if the railroad never gets built and you've sold your land for nothing? But the price they're offering is probably too good to be true." I interrupted gently. "Julian, you're a smart man. You know that if something seems too good to be true, it usually is. Maybe you should wait, see if they approach you again with a better offer. Or maybe you should sell to someone local, someone you trust." I knew from documents I had read that Thomas Whitmore was also interested in purchasing Julian's land, though at a much lower price than the railroad investors were offering. I knew that if Julian sold to Whitmore instead of the railroad, he would lose hundreds of thousands of dollars, and that's exactly what I wanted him to do. Julian hesitated, torn between the obvious financial wisdom of accepting the railroad offer and his trust in my judgment. In the end, his love for me won out over his business sense.
"You're right,"
he said finally. "I'll tell the railroad investors I'm not interested, and I'll accept Whitmore's offer instead. It's less money, but at least I'll be dealing with someone I know." I smiled and kissed him, hiding my triumph. "You're making the right decision. I'm sure of it." He made the sale to Whitmore in June of 1852. The railroad was completed in 1853, and the land Julian had sold for $50 became worth over 500 zalosen. The investors who had approached him made fortunes. Whitmore, who had purchased Julian's land and then immediately sold it to the railroad at an enormous profit, became one of the wealthiest men in Georgia, and Julian Croft, who had listened to his slave mistress instead of his own business instincts, was financially ruined. His creditors, seeing that he had squandered his last chance to pay them back, began calling in their loans. He was forced to sell more land, more slaves, more property, each sale at a loss because everyone knew he was desperate. His reputation as a shrewd businessman evaporated, replaced by whispers that he had lost his mind, that he was being manipulated by someone, that he was no longer fit to manage his own affairs. Elenina, seeing the family fortune disappearing, finally left him, taking their children, and returning to her family in Charleston. She filed for legal separation, a scandal that further damaged Julian's standing in society. By the winter of 1853, Julian had lost almost everything. The plantation was mortgaged to the hilt. Most of the slaves had been sold to pay debts. The big house was empty except for Julian and a handful of servants. And through it all, I remained by his side, the faithful mistress, the devoted lover, the only person who still believed in him. "I don't understand how this happened," Julian said to me one night, his voice broken with despair. "I made good decisions. I was careful, but everything I touched turned to disaster. It's not your fault," I soothed, stroking his hair. "You were unlucky. These things happen." He looked at me with eyes full of pain and gratitude. "You're the only good thing left in my life, Isabella. The only thing that makes any of this bearable. I don't know what I would do without you. You'll never have to find out," I promised. "I'll always be here for you." It was the cruelest lie I had ever told, because I knew that soon, very soon, I would reveal the truth and Julian would learn that the woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with everything, had been the instrument of his destruction all along. The breaking point had come and passed. Julian was broken financially and emotionally, with nothing left but his love for me, and I was about to take that away from him too. The final phase of my revenge required perfect timing and absolute precision. Julian was already broken, but he still had one thing left: hope. Hope that he could rebuild, that he could recover from his losses, that he could start over with me by his side. I was going to take that hope and crush it into dust. By early 1854, Julian's situation had become desperate. He had one asset left, the plantation itself, about 500 acres of prime Georgia farmland. Several buyers were interested, including Thomas Whitmore, who was systematically acquiring all the property in the region. If Julian could sell the plantation for a good price, he might be able to pay off his remaining debts and start fresh somewhere else. He talked about it constantly, making plans for our future together. He would sell the plantation, he said, and we would move north, perhaps to Philadelphia or New York, where the social rules were less rigid, and where we might be able to live together openly. He even talked about freeing me, about making me his wife in all but legal name. It was a fantasy, of course. Even in the North, a white man and a black woman could not live together without scandal, and Julian would never truly free me, because that would mean acknowledging that I had been enslaved in the first place, that our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of ownership and coercion. But he believed his fantasy, and that belief gave him the strength to keep going. And I encouraged that belief because I needed him to have hope so that I could take it away. The key to my final revenge was Thomas Whitmore. He was the one person who had consistently benefited from Julian's misfortunes. The rival who had been circling like a vulture, waiting for Julian to fall completely so he could pick over the remains. Julian hated Whitmore with a passion that bordered on obsession, seeing him as the author of all his troubles. He had no idea that I had been feeding information to Whitmore for over a year, using a free black woman named Sarah, who worked as a seamstress and could move between plantations without suspicion. Through Sarah, I had been telling Whitmore exactly what Julian was planning, what properties he was considering selling, what prices he was willing to accept. Whitmore had used that information to outmaneuver Julian at every turn, always staying one step ahead, always ready to exploit Julian's weaknesses. And now for the final act. I was going to give Whitmore the information that would allow him to purchase Julian's plantation for a fraction of its worth. Julian had received 2 offers for the property. One was from Whitmore, offering 40 due and owe, barely enough to cover Julian's debts. The other was from a consortium of investors from Charleston, offering 75 roros, enough to pay off his debts and leave him with a small amount of capital to start over. Julian was planning to accept the Charleston offer. It was the obvious choice, the only rational decision, but I was going to convince him to sell to Whitmore instead. The challenge was doing it in a way that seemed natural, that didn't raise Julian's suspicions. I couldn't simply tell him to sell to Whitmore. That would be too obvious, and Julian might finally question my motives. I needed to be subtle, to plant seeds of doubt about the Charleston investors, while making Whitmore's offer seem more attractive than it actually was. I began my campaign on a cold February evening. Julian had come to the cottage exhausted and depressed, carrying the 2 offers and trying to decide between them. "The Charleston offer is better," he said, spreading the documents on the table. "But I don't know these men. What if they're not reliable? What if the deal falls through?" "That would be terrible," I agreed. "After everything you've been through, you need certainty. You need to know that the sale will actually happen. Whitmore's offer is lower, but at least I know he has the money. He's been buying up property all over the county. He could close the deal immediately." "That's true," I said thoughtfully. "And there's something to be said for dealing with someone local, someone who understands the value of the land. These Charleston investors, they might try to renegotiate at the last minute or find some excuse to lower their offer. You've heard stories about that happening. I hadn't actually heard any such stories, but Julian was too stressed and desperate to question me. He nodded slowly, his face troubled. "You're right. I can't afford to have the deal fall through. Maybe I should accept Whitmore's offer even though it's lower. At least I'd know it was done." "I think that's wise," I said, moving behind him and placing my hands on his shoulders. "You've been through so much uncertainty. You deserve to have this resolved quickly so we can move on with our lives." Over the next week, I continued to reinforce this message, always subtly, always framing it as concern for Julian's well-being rather than advice about business. I expressed worry about the Charleston investors, mentioned rumors I had supposedly heard about their financial instability, suggested that taking the certain offer was better than gambling on the higher one. And Julian, worn down by years of bad luck and bad decisions, his judgment clouded by his love for me, and his desperate need to believe that things would work out, began to lean toward accepting Whitmore's offer. But I needed to ensure that he actually went through with it. I needed to push him over the edge, to make him commit to the decision before he had time to reconsider. The opportunity came in early March when Julian received a letter from the Charleston investors, asking for more time to finalize their financing. It was a routine request, the kind of delay that happened in any complex business transaction, but I seized on it as proof that my warnings had been correct. "You see," I said when Julian showed me the letter, "they're already making excuses. What if they can't get the financing? What if they back out entirely? You could lose months waiting for them. And in the meantime, Whitmore might withdraw his offer or lower it even further." Julian's face was pale with worry. "You think I should accept Whitmore's offer now?" "I think you should do what gives you peace of mind," I said carefully. "But if it were me, I wouldn't want to risk losing the certain offer while waiting for the uncertain one." That night, Julian wrote to Whitmore, accepting his offer. The sale was completed within 2 weeks, with Whitmore paying $40 for property that was worth at least twice that amount. Julian used the money to pay off his creditors, leaving him with almost nothing. But he was free of debt, and he had me, and he believed that was enough to start over. He had no idea that he had just sold his property to his greatest enemy for half its value on the advice of the woman who had been betraying him all along. And he had no idea that I was about to tell him the truth. The tension in those final weeks was almost unbearable. I knew what was coming, knew that I was about to destroy the last thing Julian had left, his belief that I loved him. And despite everything, despite my hatred and my carefully maintained coldness, I found myself feeling something I had not expected. Doubt. Not doubt about whether Julian deserved what was happening to him. He was a slaveholder, a man who had bought and sold human beings, who had torn apart families for profit. He had sold my mother to her death. He deserved everything I had done to him and more, but I was beginning to doubt whether this revenge was worth what it was costing me. For 3 years, I had played the role of Julian's devoted mistress. I had smiled when I wanted to scream, had accepted his touch when I wanted to recoil, had whispered words of love when I felt only hatred. I had twisted myself into a shape that was not my own, had become someone I barely recognized, had sacrificed pieces of my soul on the altar of vengeance. And now, standing on the edge of my final triumph, I found myself wondering, when this was over, when Julian was destroyed and my revenge was complete, what would be left of me? Would I be able to return to being Isabella? Or had I become so thoroughly the person I was pretending to be that I could never find my way back? I pushed these thoughts aside. I had come too far to turn back now. My mother's memory demanded justice. Every slave who had suffered under Julian's ownership demanded justice. I demanded justice, and I would have it, no matter what it cost. The final confrontation was set for the night after the sale was completed. Julian came to the cottage with a bottle of expensive wine, ready to celebrate the end of his troubles and the beginning of our new life together. "We did it, Isabella," he said, his face alight with relief and hope. "We're free. We can leave this place. Start over somewhere new. Just you and me." I smiled and poured the wine, my hands steady, despite the storm of emotions inside me. "That's wonderful, Julian. I'm so happy for you." We drank and Julian talked about his plans, where we would go, what we would do, how we would build a life together. He was animated in a way I hadn't seen in years. The weight of his troubles finally lifted, and I listened and smiled and waited for the right moment to destroy him completely. That moment came near midnight when Julian, relaxed by wine and happiness, pulled me into his arms and said the words he had said 1,000 times before. I love you, Isabella. You're the only good thing in my life. I don't know what I would have done without you. I pulled away from him gently and walked to the window, looking out at the dark plantation. Julian, there's something I need to tell you. What is it? He asked, his voice suddenly concerned. I turned to face him, and I let him see for the first time what I really felt. I let the mask drop. Let the hatred and contempt show in my eyes. Let him see the truth of what I was. I don't love you, I said, my voice cold and clear. I have never loved you. Everything I've done, everything I've said, every moment we've spent together, it's all been a lie. Julian stared at me, his face blank with shock. What are you talking about? I'm talking about revenge, I said. I'm talking about the fact that you destroyed my life before we ever met, and I've spent the last 3 years destroying yours in return. And then I told him everything. I told him about my mother, about how he had purchased her and then sold her south to die. I told him how I had recognized his name when I came to his plantation, how I had realized who he was and what he had done. I told him how I had deliberately made him fall in love with me, how I had used that love to manipulate him, how every bad decision he had made had been the result of my careful guidance. I told him about feeding information to Whitmore, about sabotaging his business deals, about sowing discord in his marriage. I told him how I had convinced him to sell his land to Whitmore for half its value, how I had engineered his complete financial ruin. Everything you've lost, I said, my voice shaking with emotion. You lost because of me, because I wanted you to feel what I felt when you sold my mother away. I wanted you to know what it's like to lose everything, to be powerless, to have your life destroyed by someone who sees you as nothing more than a means to an end. Julian's face had gone from shock to disbelief to horror as I spoke. Now he just sat there staring at me, as if I were a stranger, as if the woman he had loved had been replaced by someone he had never seen before. No, he whispered. No, you're lying. You're upset about something. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 3 years, I said. Every moment with you has been torture. Every time you touched me, I wanted to scream. Every time you said you loved me, I wanted to laugh in your face. You thought you were different from other masters, that your feelings for me somehow made our relationship real. But you were just a fool, Julian. A fool who fell in love with a woman who hated him and who used that love to destroy him. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian sat frozen, his face a mask of devastation, his eyes filling with tears. And I stood there watching him break, feeling my revenge finally fully realized. This was what I had worked for. This was what I had sacrificed everything to achieve. Julian Croft broken and destroyed, knowing that the woman he loved had been the architect of his ruin. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated, satisfied, complete. Instead, I felt empty, hollow, as if in destroying Julian, I had destroyed something essential in myself. But it was too late for regrets. The deed was done. The revenge was complete, and we were both destroyed by it. Julian didn't speak for a long time after my revelation. He just sat there, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with silent sobs. I watched him with a mixture of satisfaction and something else, something I didn't want to name, something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes red and devastated. Your mother, he said, his voice. Grace, I remember her. I remember the sale. Do you remember why you sold her? I asked, my voice hard. I needed capital for an investment. Cotton prices were down, and I had an opportunity to buy land at a good price. I needed cash quickly, so I sold several slaves, including Grace. It was just business. I didn't, he trailed off, finally understanding how hollow those words sounded. Just business, I repeated. My mother's life, my childhood, everything I lost, it was just business to you. I didn't know, Julian said desperately. I didn't know she had a daughter. I didn't know what would happen to her. If I had known, you would have done exactly the same thing, I interrupted. Because that's what slaveholders do. You buy and sell human beings without thinking about their families, their lives, their suffering. You tell yourselves it's just business, just economics, just the way things are. But every transaction has a human cost, Julian. And I am that cost. I am what your business created. Julian buried his face in his hands. I loved you, he whispered. I really loved you. I would have done anything for you. I would have freed you, married you if I could, given you everything I had. You did give me everything you had, I said coldly. You gave me your trust, your secrets, your heart, and I used all of it to destroy you. That's what love gets you, Julian. That's what happens when you think you can own someone and love them at the same time. So this was all revenge, and he said, looking up at me with something like wonder in his devastated eyes. 3 years of my life, 3 years of believing I had found something real, something meaningful. It was all just an elaborate revenge plot. Yes, and you felt nothing for me, nothing at all. I wanted to say yes to confirm that I had felt only hatred and contempt, that every moment had been pure calculation. But I found I couldn't quite form the words because the truth was more complicated than that. I felt what I needed to feel to make you believe me, I said finally. Whether that was real or not doesn't matter. What matters is that you believed it, and that belief destroyed you. Julian stood up slowly, moving like an old man, though he was only 42 years old. He walked to the window and stared out at the darkness, his back to me. I've lost everything, he said quietly. My fortune, my family, my reputation, my home, and now I've lost you too. Or rather, I've learned that I never had you to begin with. There's nothing left. Good, I said, though the word felt like ash in my mouth. Now you know how it feels. Now you understand what you did to my mother, to me, to every slave you ever bought or sold. You know what it's like to have everything taken from you by someone who has power over you. Is this what you wanted? Julian asked, turning to face me. Is this the satisfaction you were looking for? Because you don't look satisfied, Isabella. You look as broken as I feel. His words hit me like a physical blow because they were true. I had imagined this moment for 3 years, had dreamed of seeing Julian destroyed, and knowing that I was the cause. But now that it was here, now that I had achieved everything I had worked for, I felt no triumph. I felt only emptiness, exhaustion, and a creeping sense of horror at what I had become. It doesn't matter what I feel, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. It matters to me, Julian said. Even now, even knowing what you've done, it matters to me. Because I still love you, Isabella. God help me, I still love you. Don't, I said sharply. Don't say that. You don't love me. You love the person you thought I was, the fantasy you created. That person never existed. Maybe not, Julian agreed. But my feelings were real, even if yours weren't. And that's the cruelest part of all this, isn't it? You made me love you, and then you destroyed me with that love. It's brilliant, really. Monstrous, but brilliant. He walked toward me, and I instinctively stepped back, suddenly afraid of what he might do. But he didn't reach for me with violence. Instead, he reached out and gently touched my face, the same gesture he had made 3 years ago when this all began. I'm sorry, he said softly. I'm sorry for what I did to your mother. I'm sorry for every slave I ever bought or sold. I'm sorry for participating in a system that destroys lives and families. I'm sorry for thinking that my love for you somehow made our relationship acceptable. I'm sorry for all of it. I felt tears burning in my eyes, And I hated myself for it. I didn't want his apology. I didn't want his understanding. I wanted him to rage, to threaten, to prove that he was the monster I had convinced myself he was. "Your apology means nothing," I said, my voice shaking. "It doesn't bring my mother back. It doesn't undo the 3 years I spent pretending to love you. It doesn't change anything." "I know," Julian said. "But I needed to say it anyway because you were right about one thing. I was a fool. Not just for falling in love with you, but for thinking that I could participate in slavery and still be a good person. For thinking that my feelings somehow excused my actions for all of it." He dropped his hand and stepped back. "What happens now?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted. I hadn't thought past this moment. "I just wanted you to know the truth, to understand what you had lost and why." "Well, I know now," Julian said. "I understand, and you're right. It's worse than any physical punishment could have been. You've taken everything from me, including my illusions about myself. I thought I was better than other slaveholders because I felt genuine affection for you. But I was just another master using his power to take what he wanted, dressing it up as love to make myself feel better about it." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at me. "You're free, Isabella. I'm writing your Manna mission papers tonight. You can go wherever you want. Do whatever you want. It's the least I can do and probably the only thing I can do that has any meaning." "I don't want your freedom," I said bitterly. "I don't want anything from you." "Nevertheless, you'll have it," Julian said. "Consider it my final gift or my final apology, or whatever you want to call it. You've earned it if nothing else." He left then, walking out into the night, and I was alone in the cottage that had been my gilded cage for 3 years. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt free. Instead, I felt like I was drowning. Over the next days, the full consequences of what I had done began to unfold. Julian, true to his word, filed Manna mission papers, freeing me. But he also did something I hadn't expected. He freed all the remaining slaves on his plantation, about 15 people who had not yet been sold, to pay his debts. "If I've learned anything from this," he told the shocked overseer, "it's that slavery is a moral abomination, and I want no more part in it." The news spread quickly through the county, adding to the scandal that already surrounded Julian. A man who had lost his fortune, his family, and his mind. That's what people said. A man who had been bewitched by his mulatto mistress and driven to ruin. Some of the freed slaves left immediately, heading north to try to build new lives. Others stayed uncertain what to do with their sudden freedom, afraid of the hostile world beyond the plantation. I stayed too for a few more days, trying to understand what I was feeling, trying to make sense of the hollow victory I had achieved. It was during this time that I learned something that shattered what remained of my carefully constructed hatred. My mother was alive. The news came from one of the freed slaves, an older woman named Ruth, who had connections throughout the region. She had heard from a trader that a woman named Grace, matching my mother's description, was living on a plantation in Alabama. She had survived the brutal conditions of the cotton fields, had eventually been sold to a more humane master, and was still alive. I could find her. I could go to her, reunite with her, tell her that I had avenged what was done to us. But as I sat with this information, I realized something terrible. I didn't want to tell my mother what I had done. I didn't want to see her face when I explained how I had spent 3 years as Julian's mistress, how I had used my body and my lies to destroy him, how I had become exactly the kind of person that slavery created. Someone so warped by hatred and pain that they could sacrifice their own humanity for revenge. My mother had taught me to read, to think, to value myself. She had given me every tool she could to survive with my dignity intact. And I had thrown all of that away in pursuit of vengeance that had ultimately destroyed me as much as it had destroyed Julian. The climax of my revenge had come and gone. Julian was ruined, broken, stripped of everything he had valued. I was free with manumission papers that said I was no longer property. But we were both destroyed by what had happened between us. Julian had lost his illusions about himself and his world. And I had lost something even more fundamental. I had lost the person I might have been, the person my mother had hoped I would become. On a cold night in late March, I went to see Julian one last time. He was living in a small room in the overseer's quarters, the big house having been sold along with the plantation. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the few weeks since our confrontation. His face gaunt, his eyes hollow. "Why are you here?" he asked when he opened the door. "I don't know," I admitted. I needed to see you." He let me in and we sat in silence for a long moment. "I found out my mother is alive," I finally said. "She's in Alabama. I could go to her." "That's good," Julian said quietly. "You should go. You should be with your family." "But I don't know if I can face her," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I don't know if I can tell her what I did, what I became. She wanted me to survive with my dignity intact, and instead I destroyed myself to destroy you." Julian looked at me with something that might have been compassion. "You did what you thought you had to do. You were a slave seeking revenge against your master. There's no dignity in slavery, Isabella. There's only survival. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" I asked bitterly. "No," he said. "Nothing can make either of us feel better. We're both casualties of a system that destroys everyone it touches, the enslaved and the enslavers, the victims and the perpetrators. We're both broken by what happened between us. I wanted you to suffer," I said. "I wanted you to feel what I felt. And you do. But it doesn't help. It doesn't fix anything. It just means we're both suffering now instead of just me." "Maybe that's all revenge ever accomplishes," Julian said, spreading the pain around, making sure everyone is equally miserable. We sat in silence again. Two people who had destroyed each other, who had been destroyed by each other, who had nothing left but the wreckage of what might have been. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I finally said. "I'm going to find my mother. I'm going to try to become the person she wanted me to be, even though I don't know if that's possible anymore." "I hope you find her," Julian said. "I hope you find some peace." "What will you do?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Try to live with what I've learned, I suppose. Try to make amends in whatever small ways I can. It won't be enough. It can never be enough. But it's all I have left." I stood to leave, and Julian stood with me. At the door, I turned back to look at him one last time. "I'm sorry," I said, the words surprising me as much as they surprised him. "For what?" he asked. "For what I did to you. Not for the revenge. You deserved that, but for making you love me. For using your feelings as a weapon. For all of it." Julian smiled sadly. "I'm sorry, too. For everything. For your mother. For you. For all of it." We stood there for a moment, two people who had loved and hated and destroyed each other. Who had been both victim and perpetrator. Who had learned that revenge was a poison that killed everyone it touched. And then I left, walking out into the night, leaving Julian Croft behind forever. The scandal of our relationship, of Julian's ruin, of the freed slaves and the lost fortune, it would be talked about for years. But the truth of what had really happened, the complexity of our mutual destruction, would remain known only to us. We had both gotten what we wanted, and it had destroyed us both. I found my mother in the summer of 1854 on a small plantation outside Montgomery, Alabama. She was 41 years old. her face lined with years of hard labor and suffering. But her eyes were still bright, still full of the intelligence and strength I remembered from my childhood. When she saw me, she wept. And when I wept with her, I realized that these were the first genuine tears I had cried in years. Not tears of manipulation or performance, but real tears of grief and joy and relief. We talked for hours, days, weeks. I told her about my life after she was sold, about being purchased by Julian Croft, about everything that had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her the full truth about my relationship with Julian. About the 3 years I had spent as his mistress, about the revenge I had orchestrated. I told her I had been freed, that Julian had given me my manumission papers. I told her I had saved money and was going to purchase her freedom. But I didn't tell her the cost of that freedom, the price I had paid in pieces of my soul. My mother was owned by a man named Thomas Whitmore, the same Whitmore who had benefited so greatly from Julian's downfall. When I approached him about purchasing my mother's freedom, he looked at me with knowing eyes. "You're Isabella," he said. "Julian Croft's mistress, the woman who destroyed him." "I'm Isabella," I confirmed, "and I want to buy my mother's freedom." Whitmore studied me for a long moment. "I know what you did," he said finally. "I know you fed me information about Croft's business dealings. I know you helped engineer his ruin." I profited greatly from that information. My heart sank. I had thought my role in Julian's destruction was secret, known only to Julian and me. But of course, Whitmore had figured it out. He was a smart man, and the pattern had been too obvious. "I could expose you," Whitmore continued. "Tell people that you were a spy, that you deliberately destroyed your master. It would be quite a scandal."
What do you want?
I asked, my voice flat. "Nothing," Whitmore said, surprising me. "I'm going to free your mother, and I'm not going to charge you anything for it. Consider it payment for the information you provided me. I made a fortune from Croft's misfortunes, and I'm not so ungrateful as to deny you this small thing." He was true to his word. My mother was freed within the week, and Whitmore never spoke publicly about my role in Julian's downfall. My mother and I moved north to Philadelphia, where we could live as free women without the constant threat of being kidnapped and returned to slavery. We opened a small boarding house for other freed slaves and fugitives, providing them with a safe place to stay as they built new lives. I never married. I never allowed myself to love anyone. Never trusted myself with that kind of intimacy again. The 3 years I had spent with Julian had taught me that I was capable of a coldness, a calculation, a cruelty that terrified me. I had used love as a weapon, and I could never be sure that I wouldn't do it again if I felt threatened or hurt. My mother never asked me directly about what had happened with Julian, but I think she knew, or at least suspected. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me with an expression of profound sadness, as if she could see the damage that had been done to me, the ways I had been warped by slavery and revenge. "You survived," she told me once. "That's what matters. You survived, and you're free, and we're together again. Whatever you had to do to make that happen, you survived." But I wasn't sure that was true. I had survived physically, yes, but something essential in me had died during those 3 years with Julian. The girl my mother had raised, the girl who had loved learning and dreaming and believing in the possibility of goodness. That girl was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, more damaged. I heard news of Julian occasionally through the network of freed slaves and abolitionists who passed through our boarding house. He had left Georgia, moved to a small town in Tennessee, and was living quietly working as a carpenter. He had joined an abolitionist society and was speaking publicly about the evils of slavery, using his own story as a cautionary tale about how the institution corrupted everyone it touched. Some people praised him for his courage in speaking out. Others condemned him as a hypocrite, a former slaveholder trying to absolve himself of guilt. I didn't know what to think. I had destroyed Julian Croft, the slaveholder, but I had also created Julian Croft, the abolitionist. Was that a victory or just another form of destruction? The Civil War came in 1861, and with it the promise of emancipation for all enslaved people. My mother and I worked with the Underground Railroad, helping fugitives escape to freedom, providing shelter and support. It was dangerous work, but it felt like atonement, like a way to balance the scales for what I had done. My mother died in 1867, 2 years after the war ended. She was 54 years old, worn out by years of slavery and hard work. But she died free in her own bed, surrounded by people who loved her. That was more than most enslaved people ever got. After her death, I continued running the boarding house, but my heart wasn't in it anymore. I felt untethered, purposeless, haunted by the choices I had made and the person I had become. In 1870, I received a letter. It was from Julian Croft. He was dying. The letter said consumption had taken hold of his lungs, and the doctors gave him only a few months to live. He wanted to see me one last time, to talk to me, to say things that had been left unsaid. I almost didn't go. What was the point? What could either of us say that would change anything? But in the end, curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, compelled me to make the journey to Tennessee. I found Julian in a small house on the outskirts of a town I had never heard of. He was 49 years old, but looked 70, his body wasted by disease, his face gaunt and pale. But his eyes were still the same, intelligent, sad, and full of a complicated mixture of emotions when he saw me. "Isabella," he said, his voice weak. "You came." "I came," I confirmed, sitting in the chair beside his bed. We talked for hours about everything and nothing. About the war, about emancipation, about the world that was emerging from the ashes of slavery. And finally, inevitably, we talked about us. "I've spent 16 years trying to understand what happened between us," Julian said, "trying to make sense of it, to find some meaning in it, and I think I finally have." "What meaning could there possibly be?" I asked. "That we were both victims of slavery," he said. "Not equal victims. You suffered far more than I ever did. But we were both damaged by it. Both twisted into shapes we were never meant to be. You became someone who could use love as a weapon. I became someone who could own human beings and call it natural. Slavery destroyed us both, just in different ways." "That's too simple," I said. "You chose to be a slaveholder. I didn't choose to be enslaved." "You're right," Julian agreed. "But I was raised in a system that taught me slavery was acceptable, that black people were inferior, that my power over you was natural and right. It took lowering everything, my fortune, my family, my illusions about myself, to understand how wrong that was. You gave me that understanding, Isabella. You destroyed me. But you also freed me from a lie I had been living my entire life. I didn't do it to free you," I said bitterly. "I did it to hurt you." "I know," Julian said, "but intentions don't always determine outcomes. You hurt me, yes, but you also changed me. You made me see the truth about slavery, about myself, about the world I lived in. And I've spent the last 16 years trying to make amends for what I was trying to help end the system that created both of us." "Does that make you feel better?" I asked. "Does it absolve you?" "No," Julian said simply. "Nothing can absolve me. Nothing can undo the harm I did. But I had to try anyway because the alternative was to live with the knowledge of what I had been and do nothing about it." We sat in silence for a while. Two people who had destroyed each other and been destroyed by each other. Who had loved and hated with equal intensity. Who had been both victim and perpetrator in a system that made monsters of everyone. I loved you, Julian said finally. I know you don't want to hear that. I know it doesn't matter, but it's true. I really did love you, Isabella. Not the fantasy I created, but you. The real you, the person I glimpsed sometimes beneath the performance, the intelligent, strong, damaged woman who was capable of such extraordinary patience and planning. I loved that person, even knowing what she was doing to me. How could you love someone who was destroying you? I asked. How could you spend 3 years with someone and feel nothing? He counted. You're not as cold as you pretend to be, Isabella. I saw it sometimes in unguarded moments. You felt something for me, even if it was just pity or guilt. We weren't as simple as victim and perpetrator, as slave and master. We were two broken people caught in an impossible situation, trying to survive in the only ways we knew how. I wanted to deny it, to insist that I had felt nothing but hatred. But I was tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of carrying the weight of what I had done. Maybe I did feel something, I admitted. Not love. I don't think I'm capable of that anymore. But something pity, like you said, or recognition. You were broken by slavery just like I was, just in a different way. And maybe in some twisted way, we understood each other better than anyone else ever could. Julian smiled weakly. That's more than I hoped for. Thank you for that honesty. He died 3 days later with me sitting beside his bed. His last words were an apology, not to me specifically, but to all the people he had harmed, all the lives he had damaged, all the suffering he had caused. I buried him in the local cemetery, paying for a simple headstone that read Julian Croft, 1821-1870. He learned too late, but he learned. After his death, I returned to Philadelphia and continued my work with freed slaves and fugitives. But something had changed in me during those final conversations with Julian. I had spent 16 years defining myself by my revenge, by what I had done to him. But now he was gone, and I had to figure out who I was without that defining purpose. I never fully succeeded. I remained damaged, hardened, unable to trust or love or believe in the possibility of genuine connection. But I tried to do good work, to help others, to make some small amends for the person I had become. I lived until 1903, long enough to see my grandnieces and grandnephews born into a world where slavery was illegal, where black people had rights, at least on paper, where the future seemed to hold more promise than the past. But I never forgot Julian, never forgot what we had done to each other, never forgot the lesson we had both learned too late. That revenge is a poison that kills everyone it touches, that love and hate are sometimes indistinguishable, and that slavery destroys the souls of everyone it touches, enslaved and enslaver alike. On my deathbed, surrounded by family who loved me, but never fully understood me, I thought about that night in 1854, when I had revealed the truth to Julian, when I had destroyed him and destroyed myself in the process. If I could do it over again, would I make different choices? Would I choose forgiveness over revenge, healing over destruction? I don't know. I honestly don't know. All I know is that we were both casualties of a war that began long before we were born. A war between human dignity and human greed, between love and power, between the people we were meant to be and the people slavery made us become. And in that war, there were no winners, only survivors, and even survival came at a cost too high to measure. This was the story of Isabella, born into slavery in Georgia around 1831. She spent 3 years as the mistress of Julian Croft, using his love for her to engineer his complete financial and emotional ruin as revenge for his role in selling her mother. After gaining her freedom, she reunited with her mother and moved to Philadelphia, where she ran a boarding house for freed slaves and worked with the Underground Railroad. She never married and lived until 1903, carrying the weight of her choices for her entire life. Julian Croft, destroyed by Isabella's betrayal, became an abolitionist and spent his final years speaking against slavery before dying of consumption in 1870. Their story became a whispered legend in abolitionist circles, a cautionary tale about the corrupting power of slavery and the devastating cost of revenge, a reminder that the institution destroyed everyone when it touched, regardless of which side of the chains they stood on. The echoes of Isabella and Julian's tragic entanglement reverberate through time, a haunting reminder that slavery corrupted, not just through physical chains, but through the emotional and psychological destruction it wrought on everyone involved. Their story shows us that revenge, no matter how justified, carries a cost that can never be fully calculated, and that love and hate can become so intertwined that they destroy both the lover and the beloved. If these profound stories of human complexity, moral ambiguity, and the devastating legacy of slavery move you, join our community. Subscribe to Slave Revenge to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of history. Your support helps preserve these powerful narratives. Leave a comment sharing how Isabella and Julian's story affected you. Did it make you cry, make you think, make you question the nature of justice and revenge?